So I'm grateful to Alex and C.S. Watt for sponsoring this lecture this evening, and also to the Department of Asian Studies for inviting me. And thank all of you for coming. So I'll jump right into it. So the title of my talk tonight is The Impact of the Internet on the Development of Chinese Languages. And you notice that I say languages. And I'm not just talking about Tibetan and Uyghur and Wa and all these other languages that are not Sinitic, but I'm talking also about Sinitic languages, not as just one language. So I think I'll talk about Cantonese later tonight, and I actually think Cantonese is a language, and I'll explain why somewhat. Okay, so how I've been, Jinhua mentioned that I corrected some of his pinyin maybe 15, 20 years ago, and I'm very fussy about pinyin. You got to get it right, and I always correct pinyin. And I actually know the inventor of pinyin. He's 108 years old now. His name's Zhou Youguang, and he's a good friend of mine. So pinyin is a very big thing in my life, and I actually had a pinyin means spelling, romanization. I had a pinyin journal that I ran for 10 years, and my wife wrote her childhood memoirs purely in pinyin. And they're beautiful, they're wonderful. So a lot of what I do circles around the matter of romanization or pinyin when I get involved in Chinese language development, and I'll explain. So the first thing I'm talking about now is character amnesia. This is a term that I invented, I coined, and it's now being used widely. Let me explain that this is, I write blogs for this outfit called Language Log. And you can't see it here, but I'm down here somewhere, Victor Mair. Not all of them, maybe, a quarter of the people there have something to do with the University of Pennsylvania, where I teach. And I don't consider myself a linguist, but these very fine, outstanding linguists, they used to come to me because they would read something that people called Cinglish. I guess you all know what Cinglish is. It's butchered English. Like people are trying to translate Chinese into English, and they end up with something called Cinglish. So my linguist colleagues, they couldn't make head nor tail of it. And they used to come to me and say, Victor, can you explain what this really means and why it ended up this way? So that started about 8-10 years ago. And the most famous blog that I wrote back then, which has been read by millions of people, is about this. It's very, very vulgar. A character, gan, which can mean dry or something else very bad. So when they want to say dried fruit, they might say something very ornery. And so I wrote a long, long blog about that. That was probably the first blog I wrote for Language Log, and I did it as a guest blogger. And these things were so popular, they just said, write another one, and here's some more stuff to write about. And so I just got sucked into this. So I always did language, and I love language. And as an undergrad at Dartmouth, I actually didn't study Chinese. And one time at Dartmouth, I saw a Chinese character on the blackboard. I was an English major. And there was a very famous Chinese scholar there, Wing Sit Chan. I'm sure most of you know that name. And there were no Chinese courses, not even Chinese history. But he was there doing religion. And I guess once in a while he'd teach a course on Chinese religion. And so one time I saw this Chinese character on the board that he must have written there and left it from some class. And I looked at it and I said, oh my gosh, that is so difficult. How could anyone possibly read that stuff? I still remember being flummoxed by my first encounter with the Chinese script at Dartmouth there. And I went back to studying Chaucer. But you see, there's a kind of bridge between what I did with Chaucer and what I do in Chinese, because Chaucer was the first great vernacular writer in English. He sort of created vernacular writing for English, and I love it. I love Chaucer. And then through a very circuitous route, through Buddhist studies, I ended up doing Chinese literature. And what did I write my dissertation on? And what did I study and investigate for the first 20 years? Something called Bianwen, transformation texts, which were the earliest vernacular writings in Chinese. They were found in a cave at Dunhuang Caves in Central Asia. So there I was. I did Chaucer for Middle English, and I did Middle Chinese vernacular Dunhuang text. So I see it as kind of the same kind of problems. Why did people start writing vernacular in England when they did? And why did people start writing vernacular in China when they did in the medieval period? Well, I'm talking about the internet tonight, so I talked in Bruce Rusk's class about the growth of vernacular. But I just wanted to tell you that there is some kind of continuity between what I did in English literature and what I'm doing in Chinese literature. So since I'm always interested in vernacular, vernacular is basically writing the way you talk, 口语. It's very different from 书面语, which is 文言文 written down. And it's a pure writing, book language. And people do not talk 书面语. You really can't. It's what Y.R. Zhao, the great linguist, would say, unsayable. He called 文言文 unsayable. He had this standard of what could be said intelligibly. People could say something and other people could hear it and understand. But I always say that if you don't, you can't have an unrehearsed conversation in classical Chinese. You can't have a spontaneous, unrehearsed conversation in classical Chinese. The only way you could do it is if you were extremely learned and you were talking to somebody who was just as learned as you, and you were talking only in quotations from the classics or from the ancient texts, because you can't just make things up and converse. It's for writing. But vernacular is writing the way you talk. So we talk about the vernaculars. So Taiwanese, Cantonese, Shanghainese, they would all be vernaculars. And Mandarin is one of these. And this is the vernacular. It happens to be the national language. But Mandarin is also, we call it 中文, so we call it 中文 when it's written. But it's the only vernacular that is written commonly in China. The other vernaculars normally are not written. Through a tour de force, you can write Cantonese, but you have to use 1,000 special characters that are not used to write Zhongwen. They're characters just made up for Cantonese. So Taiwanese, very rarely is it written. It's almost impossible. It was written, what happens with Taiwanese, for example? You want to write Taiwanese? You write it with romanization. And I learned Cantonese through romanization because I just didn't know those 1,000 special characters to write Cantonese, and most people don't. So romanization is one way to write down what you speak. But you can do it in Bopomorpho too, Juyin Fu Hao. You can do it with various kinds of phonetic annotation. But the most common one now is romanization. Okay, so I gradually became a linguist because of my experience at Language Law. And I have to say, I got sucked into archaeology in a similar fashion. I gradually became an archaeologist over 20 years to work on the mummies. So I started out as a philologist, Buddhologist, then I became an archaeologist, and now I spend most of my time doing linguistics, especially writing for them. But it's a different kind of scholarship too, because I used to write books. I still write some books and articles for journals, but more and more I'm writing stuff for the internet, which is, it's not ephemeral because these things last. You know, you can read them 10, 15 years after they're written, but they're in electronic form. They're not in printed form, ever. So, I also have to say that when you publish a blog like this, instantaneously it's read by tens of thousands of people all over the world. And there are some really sharp minds out there who are going to criticize you if you make a mistake. They're very, very fine scholars who read this religiously, assiduously. So I have to be very careful when I write these blogs, because I guarantee you if I make a mistake, it will be caught, even if it's an opinion mistake. But I don't make many opinion mistakes. Occasionally, rarely. So that first one was the one about dry that made me famous and made me become a linguist. And this was a later one. This is dated July 22nd, 2010. But people are still citing it a lot. And somebody just today said she wanted to sent me an email and said, I want to write my master's thesis about character amnesia. I'm really intrigued by it. Can you tell me the scholarly literature on character amnesia? I said, that's it. You just go read that. It's pretty long, but it's not like a scholarly paper because it doesn't really have footnotes and annotations. Sometimes I have textual references. But you know, one thing we do instead of footnotes in bibliography, we have links. And you know, something like this, like, I gotta make sure I don't do it. See, this would take you right to this article. So a lot of times I'll have a dozen or more links in my blog. But okay, how did this come up? So many of my Chinese friends have forgotten how to write Chinese characters because they use computers to write for them. And I'm telling you, it is amazing how I'll prove it to you in a moment, how they forget to write even very common characters. And it's very embarrassing for them. And look, if you've been using a computer to write Chinese characters for 20 years, it's a neuromuscular activity. Neuromuscular. It's the same as like playing a violin. If you don't practice every day, you're going to forget, or piano, because that's neuromuscular too, very muscular. And if you're just going like this all day, you forget how to do the strokes. So 95% or more of all Chinese enter characters into computers with romanization. So there we go, back to pinyin, short text messaging. Now you can write the characters on a flat glass plate. You know, there are character recognition software programs, but not many people use them. Very few people. Most people, nearly everyone, you could say almost, is doing pinyin to enter. Over 95% are using pinyin to enter characters. So they get used to the character. They get used to pinyin, romanization. They get very familiar with it. And every child in China, in the People's Republic of China, learns how to write kanji, Hanzi, how to write characters. They learn to read first with pinyin. Every child. And also most children in China, I would say everyone, and it even started as early as first grade, they're learning English, which is also in romanization. So they're very familiar with romanization. But the real sticking point is that they're using romanization to enter characters all the time. And I have a lot of Chinese friends who've been doing this. One friend was a translator at the United Nations. His name was Apollo Wu Mancho, from Cantonese speaker. And the interesting thing about Apollo, his Mandarin pronunciation is terrible. Very, very strong Cantonese accent. But he can do romanized inputting of Mandarin, no problem. And he's very fast and very good at it. And he will tell you, frankly, right to your face, I forgot how to write the characters. Because he's been doing it for 20 years with his computer. In fact, he doesn't even want to write characters by hand at all. And my wife got to be that way, and she's very learned. She was very learned in Chinese. And she's a Chinese teacher. Now, in some places, like Singapore, anybody here from Singapore? Well, that's surprising. In Singapore, they've pretty much given up on forcing students to learn to write characters by hand. So they're saying you can take computers into the exams. Oh yeah, it's the Ministry of Education approves it, sanctioned it. They were losing the battle. And so the students, of course, are very happy. They just take their computer into the exam and write their Chinese characters with the computer. This is the reality. So that's what I mean by character amnesia, forgetting how to write characters. And the main reason why people are forgetting how to write characters is because of computers and cell phones. Of course, people who love the characters are alarmed by this. They're frightened, they're terrified, because we're going to lose our heritage. Our children are not learning, not only our children, we ourselves are forgetting how to write characters. Now, there are some, what should I say, old-fashioned or determined friends of mine who said, I'm not going to be a victim of this. And for like 15 years, my good friend, Xu Wenkan, who is a top editor, do you know him? Yeah. He's a top editor at the Hanyu Dacidian, very brilliant scholar and very fine scholar. And for many, many years, he refused to use a computer, and he would write everything out by hand, scan it, and send it to me, or fax it to me. He said, I'm not going to be a victim of computers because I don't want to forget how to write Chinese characters. And but guess what? Even he is now using characters, using romanization to write Chinese in computers. And it's going to have an impact on him, even though he's such a super scholar of Old Chinese. So I wrote a number of other blogs about character amnesia, later ones, 2012, 2013, another one in 2013, and I still write some blogs about different aspects of character amnesia. So the character amnesia revisited, and then this is what I'm going to talk about quite a bit tonight, this spelling bees and character amnesia. So, Chinese educational authorities, parents, they were very worried that the characters were going to disappear, or that the ability of the characters weren't going to disappear because the computers would keep writing them. but that people, children, would forget how to write them with a pen or a brush. So they knew about spelling bees in America, which are a very big deal and very exciting, usually won by Indians, almost always, because Indians know how to memorize things very well. And they have traditions going back 3,000 years how to memorize gigantic texts. So I think that has something to do with it, the heritage of memorization and its very sophisticated methods for memorizing in India. So the Chinese said, Chinese educational authorities, Chinese TV shows, and they said, we're going to have spelling bees in China. But, oh, wait a minute, we don't have spelling. So I'll show you what they did, how to adapt spelling bees to China. But then I have another blog on character amnesia and the emergence of digraphia. So that's something else I talk a lot about, digraphia. Because the digraphia means, okay, don't anyone ever accuse me of saying that I advocate replacing the characters with romanization. Don't say that. That would be a falsehood. I do not advocate that. But I do think that something's going to happen naturally, and it is happening already now. And that is what I call the emergence. Yeah, digraphia is emerging. That means Hanzi and Pinyin developing in parallel for the appropriate purposes. Well, Pinyin is used in Chinese ships for semaphore. It's used for Braille. I mean, it's been used for that, for these purposes for a long time. But now, more and more people, when they forget how to write a character, they'll just substitute pinyin and won't make a big deal of it, especially people writing on the internet, if they forget a character. In fact, they put in pinyin more and more often on the internet just for effect. To be fashionable. They mix it in with the Hanzi. So there are for many reasons why digraphia is emerging now. A lot of it has to do with pinyin, but I've just been writing about, I just wrote, my latest blog was about, it mentioned the term bi ge, oh God, the young people are laughing. The young people know it's very crude, very vulgar. And I'm not going to tell you what bi really means, but it is ubiquitous in China. And it's so vulgar that most people won't write the real character. It's scandalous. But people say it all the time, but it's so interesting that they won't translate the real meaning either, and they won't even think of the real meaning, so they make it sound like just the opposite. One of the most vulgar things in Chinese that you can think of, your mother's something. They say that it means awesome. Well, it's a cow's thing. And they say it means awesome and great and wonderful and spectacular. This cow bee. I'm not going to say the English word. Okay, so everybody's saying this. Oh my goodness. So not only do they use another character, which means press upon. It's just totally for the sound. And so that's what I wrote about today, bi ge, like pressing upon your style, but it's really that other bi. But most people, I mean, they just don't, Most people cannot bring themselves to think about it even. They just say, it means awesome. So a lot of people, rather than write force, compel, that be, which is pretty complicated, a lot of strokes, and it means something wrong for that. You know, it has a totally different meaning, the character. So they just write A, B, C, D, B, the B. That's very common. So you see this romanization is creeping into Chinese that way for like a taboo character. Or people, well, you know, the most famous literary character in the 20th century was AQ. And Q is just Q, and then you have QQ now. And QQ, how do you write it in Hanzi? You don't. So there's all these terms. In Chinese, you call them 字母词. That means that lettered words. Lettered words. Words like WTO. That's in Chinese. The best and most important Chinese dictionaries now, like Hanyu, 现代汉语词典, that's like the Websters of China. 现代汉语词典. In the back, it has a whole big section just for 字母词, lettered words. So the Roman alphabet is just, I have said that a long time ago, that the Roman alphabet has become a part of the Chinese script. But someone said it wrote an article about it in a journal that I published, Sino-Platonic Papers. Some of you may know this person, Mark Hensel. He has a Berkeley PhD, about 35 years ago. He teaches at Carleton College. And there are Chinese scholars who write about this too, Liu Yongquan, for example, about how Roman letters are part of the Chinese writing system. It's not that weird for something other than Chinese characters to become part of the Chinese writing system. I'm sure Jinhua will know when I say 万字, you know, the character for 10,000. It's a swastika. The simplified character, the old simplified character for 10,000, Yiwan, the Wan, was the swastika. And that became a part of the Chinese writing system a long time ago. And I've written papers about the swastika in Chinese writing that go back to the Neolithic. So that, things get incorporated into the Chinese writing system. And that, Ling, how many people take the time to write, the one with the rain radical on top? For Ling, 0. I think almost everybody writes it that way. Right? But that's not originally a Chinese character. So even the writing system evolves, and it's really evolving fast under the impact of the internet because of character amnesia and inputting and these trendy, nifty things or taboo words, playful language, 字母词. So it's just people are becoming more and more familiar with I've got to get my watch out and start thinking about time. Let me see. Well, I'll still talk for about 20 minutes, maybe 15. So now here's some proof of a person forgetting how to write Chinese characters. This person, this is such a precious document, and it's sort of like retrieved from the garbage. This is a shopping list. Oh, somebody's taking a photo. Great. Go ahead. Everybody take photos. This is a precious document that was retrieved essentially from the garbage. It's a shopping list for jiaozi. And the person who wrote it has a PhD and is sociology researcher from Shekeyuan. Oh my God. 太丢脸, huh? But it's not. 很自然. This, of course, this person, if I took this and showed it to that person, would be so 惭愧. They would feel so horrible. But it's so honest. So look, there are how many characters here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. They got 3 out of 14 wrong. There are 8 words, and they got 3 out of 8 words wrong. And can you believe they couldn't write the character for sha? Shrimp, which is a simplified character, and it's pretty darn simple. Look at that. And they couldn't write the character for egg. My God. And 韭菜. Look at that. They really blew it. They just like... But that's an educated person in China, very highly educated person, who probably is writing Chinese all the time with computers. And here, she was running out the door to the store and did it on a piece of paper. And that's the result. And that's, I say, this is an honest testament of history. And this to me is as important as the Dunhuang manuscripts, that piece of paper. Because most people will deny that they do this, but they do. Everybody does it. Even simple words. So, enough of that. The impact was great. So I'm going to show you what it looks like when they're doing a spelling bee. It's really tense, and they have the atmosphere builds, and the family is there, the mom and dad, and they're going, when the students are writing these things. So they have to write them down in the 方块字, in this square-shaped block. So the moderator will say, write such and such a term. And they freak out, like, gosh, can I do it? And then, so you do it, you see they're doing it with 简体字. That's 诅咒, which would mean like curse, imprecation. And it's a lot of fun. It was very popular for a couple of years. I don't know if it's still going. There were 2 shows in China, TV shows. I watched them on YouTube. It was fun. And so the idea of this was to say, come on, kids, learn how to write the characters, and you might get famous if you can write them on the TV show. There was a lot of hoopla about this. And I think it helped at least a few kids who were willing to sacrifice a lot of their time to learn how to write characters by hand. Because most kids, starting out from grade school are not writing characters by hand. It's such an easy cop-out to write with a computer. Now, I myself, was like my friend Xu Wenkan. I wouldn't write characters with a computer for the longest time because I knew once I started doing that, my ability to write characters would deteriorate very fast. And I held out for, about 5, 10 years, and all of my colleagues were saying, Victor, why don't you ever type Chinese? And I say, well, I just don't want to. Because I want to preserve my ability to write characters. And they would say, but it's so easy, and it looks better than your handwriting. It's true. My handwriting in English and in Chinese is awful, execrable. But still, I could keep writing, and they all forgot. All my colleagues at Penn, and everywhere, just forgetting how to write Chinese characters. But then, I kept pretending like I don't even know the technology of how to do Chinese characters. I don't want to learn it. And I am a kind of technophobe. I'm not a Luddite. Definitely not a Luddite, somebody who breaks up new technology. In fact, I'm a great advocate of technology. And some of my most important papers recently have been based on, like the GAI paper, definitely based on using huge databases. But I ask my students to do it for me, to run the searches, like Boucher and Capitanio and all these guys. So, but then finally, I got seduced onto Google Translate because, I just peek at it from time to time. And then I start to realize, oh, Google Translate can write characters for you, and it's really, really, really easy. You just type in the pinyin in that box. Up comes the characters. Oh, man. And so I've succumbed. And now I use Google Translate to produce most of the characters in my blogs. Because before, in my blogs, it used to be hell because I didn't have the characters to put in, and I'd have to go through all kinds of contortions to get the characters into my blogs. And then also, I didn't know how to get tones onto the romanization. But Google Translate does all of that for you. And also, I tell you, it's just, to me, it's mind-boggling. It's incomprehensible that, this is just one aspect of technology nowadays, that I can be sitting in my office at Penn, or in Singapore, or in the dorm here, St. John's here in UBC, and I put something into the Google Translate box. It comes back with character, and translated instantaneously. I can put in a big section of Chinese like this. I cannot comprehend, and I don't even know where it's doing it, somewhere in Oregon maybe. And they have supercomputers, and it happens instantaneously, like whoosh, there's this whole big Chinese translation from, I put in some English, or put in some Chinese, now comes the English. Or not, I do German or Norwegian, and it's all this Turkish. It's all just coming out immediately. And it boggles my mind how it happens. And okay, you may say, oh, it's not a good translation. I could see some people in their brains going, Professor Mair, it's not a good translation. But I can clean them up. I can do a good translation, or at least if I have to read a long Chinese text, say a newspaper, I don't want to spend the time reading a newspaper text, I can put that in and I can get an idea very quickly from this rough translation. It's pretty good. So that's how the spelling bee in China, or the character writing contests, have been like a reaction in an attempt to halt the deterioration of the ability to write characters on the part of the Chinese population, especially young people. There's another way that the internet, some of the young people know this too. Okay, so everybody knows the 草泥马, or the 河蟹, the river crab. And this, okay, at first when I sent it to Bruce, I said, I'm going to put all this stuff on it. It goes down hundreds and hundreds of terms. And then I thought, oh, just a few for examples. And this is the attempt of young people to circumvent the Great Firewall in China, the censorship system. So they want to use this vulgar expression, and then they invent this character, this grass mud horse. And it's kind of cute. And they have dolls and so forth, but whenever you have that doll. Okay, so there's a constant battle between the censors in China and the netizens. They're called netizens, who figure out different ways to say things and get their message across. Of course, the Chinese censors are very resourceful, and they've got a lot of money, and there are many of them, so they just, So the Chinese censors will put up this block. You cannot say he xie. You cannot say mo li, jasmine. Jasmine is ruled out, even though Hu Jintao liked to sing that song, mo li hua. You cannot say it. You cannot write it. So whatever, the netizens will come up with a way to get around it. And usually it's a homophone, or a near homophone. But then again, one of the ways that the netizens use to circumvent the Great Firewall and other censorship mechanisms of the Chinese government is Romanization. And all kinds of variations on Romanization. There are abbreviations, Romanized abbreviations. And so it keeps the Chinese censors very much on their toes. But that's another way, because a lot of these terms then become part of, they may be a Romanized expression, they become a part of daily discourse, especially among young people. So it's very natural for them to use these terms in their writing, even though they started out as a way to escape censorship in China. So I call that creeping Romanization. So like AQ, that was an early creeping of Romanization into Chinese. But then a father in China wanted to name his son C, just ABC, Zhao C. And the Chinese registration authorities say, you can't do that because C isn't a part of the isn't part of the Chinese writing system. But then the father went to court and he says, well, it is because there's this term that, let me tell you, every letter of the alphabet is part of the Chinese writing system. I've done a lot of archaeology in China. And every archaeology site I've been to, if it's of a cemetery and they want to refer to a particular grave, they never write Fen Mu de Mu. They always write M, like M170, M172. All Chinese archaeologists do that, even ones who don't know English or don't know English very well. That's the Chinese word for them. That M is the abbreviation of Mu, Fen Mu de Mu. So this is how Romanization sort of creeps into the Chinese writing system. This is a fun game I used to do. I've been watching people doing computers in China for 20, 25 years, as soon as it started. I've followed how computers were. I had conferences at Penn on computerization of Chinese before anybody else had conferences. And I always observe people, stand behind people in China and watch them do inputting. And they will say, oh, I don't use Romanization. But then you watch them. And if they can't, there's a system called Wubi, Wubi Zixing. It's like shapes of characters, putting in different components. And you really have to know how to write the character to be able to enter it. And you have to deconstruct it into these different components. So you really have to know your characters to input with those what I call shape-based systems. But most people don't, the only people who can really use those systems well are professionals. They do it as their job, and they get good at it, and they're fast. But normal human beings cannot really get good at those shape-based inputting systems. Changjie in Taiwan and Hong Kong is a shape-based inputting system. And that's because people in Taiwan and Hong Kong are really what should I say? They care more about the characters than in China. Don't forget, China has simplified the characters, and to the people in Taiwan and Hong Kong, that's a desecration, simplification. They really don't like it. But people in China, they think, 简体字, that's the real characters now. Those are the real characters. And, you know, when I first write it, I'm a traditionalist and a conservative. And when I first wrote my blogs, I always used 繁体字, the traditional forms. But I got so much flack from Chinese readers. They're saying, what's wrong with you? Why don't you use 简体字? What's wrong? You know, 中华人民共和国 is the real China. Why are you writing this Taiwan and Hong Kong stuff? I got a lot of angry people complaining. Don't use 繁体. The real characters now are 简体. And so I gave up. And now I use 简体, the simplified characters in my blogs, and everybody's happy. I mean, because most of the people who read it, who are Chinese, are, like most Chinese are from China. And this even goes with pronunciations, like I say Li Bo, but I get corrected. No, not Li Bo, it's Li Bai. And so sooner or later I get knocked down because you just go with the flow. And the China flow is very big. It's like the Huanghe or the Yangtze, it's just too big to resist. Well, hey, you won't even believe this, but I used to love something called 国语罗马字, tonal spelling. It was invented by the great Y.R. Zhao, this great linguist that I told you about. Oh man, that is a sophisticated spelling system, but it's very, very hard. And basically, normal human beings can't learn it. It's too hard. There are spelling rules and so forth, and it's complicated. But you can spell the tones with that, 国语罗马字. But if you learn it, you speak Chinese with good tones because they're spelled right in. It's not a fuhao, it's not a diacritical or a number. So when I first started learning Chinese, and when I first wrote my first papers, in academic papers, I used 国语罗马字 for years. But journals didn't want to publish it, and publishers didn't want to publish it, and readers didn't want to read it. So I gave up. And then I was using Wade Giles for a long time because English-speaking people had used it for 100 years, and I said, well, this is what we use. But then, again, you see, I went, you know, 中华人民共和国, People's Republic of China, is China. So they say Hanyu Pinyin is the official romanization of the People's Republic of China. And it's also the official romanization of the United Nations and the official romanization of the International Standards Organization. And this you may not know. Hanyu Pinyin is not only the official romanization in China for 单字, single characters. They have a Hanyu Pinyin 正词法. 正词法 means orthography. For words, there are official rules in Chinese for the spelling of words, like 桌子, it's a word. Two characters, 2 syllables, but it's one word, table. And they have very sophisticated, very complete set of rules telling you how to parse into words and how to deal with different grammatical forms. Pinyin, that's official rule. It's like a law of China that you really should do your romanization that way. So now another thing about the Chinese writing system, because of the 简体字, the Kangxi radicals no longer work. Okay, when I was a graduate student, I memorized all 214 Kangxi radicals. Every decent graduate student when I was at Harvard, or people at Berkeley would do the same thing, Stanford, Yale, you would memorize all 214 numbers of the radical, the busho. And if you didn't, you weren't a good student. But now, guess what? In China, there's no standard system of radicals. And I consider this like a national tragedy. Sometimes it's 181, 186. Kangxi was 214. And it was that way since the Kangxi. It was from before Kangxi. Because Kangxi got it from somebody named Mair in the, I think, late Ming. 214. Now, there is no necessary number of radicals for Chinese writing. First of all, the Chinese writing system is open-ended. People just keep inventing more characters. People invent characters for their own name. They really do. And so there's no end. Essentially, Chinese writing system could be infinite in terms of the number of characters in it. So the number of radicals is also flexible. It's just, we were lucky to have the Kangxi radicals for 3 centuries or so. But now I feel so adrift because there's no standard set of radicals for Chinese writing system. And what's even worse, Chinese artists, you see artists, it's usually the artists who are doing this. Wait.
Try it on.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. So there, artist Zhao Yingqi's. I have a student at Penn who's studying all these artists who make up their own radicals, and they say, for example, we need a radical for pollution. And they'll make a radical for pollution characters and put a bunch of characters under that radical. And so this is another way the Chinese writing system is changing under the impact of modern forms of communication. And then SNS, so you see they have this morpheme. Here's a whole new morpheme in Chinese. That's, the people who do it, the people who do SNS. And you can see this is the Chinese version, this is the English version, but in the Chinese version, they use, first of all, they use these they use this alphabet, and then they use this morpheme even. And I've documented in my posts, the incorporation of English morphemes into Chinese. Let me see if I can find some. Well, Facebook, Cinglish, right there, Ren Ren R, QQ Kongjian R. It's people who do that, and that's in Chinese. And sometimes you can find a lot more English lettered words, what I call lettered words, or even morphemes in things that you read on the internet. So the internet is where it's happening. I had the first 40 years of my career as a sinologist, a very serious sinologist, philologist. It was all books and articles and traditional learning, traditional scholarship. Look what I've morphed into and transformed into, writing blogs. And I'm very glad that I was able to catch the wave before I got too old. And actually, this keeps me young, to just see what's happening and how Chinese is changing. And you know what? You can't stop it. The internet has its own inertia. And young people are so full of vitality and imagination and creativity that you just can't keep them down. You can't legislate against it. So there's a craze for learning English in China. Everybody wants to learn English, even though the educational authorities, almost every year, they come out and say, this is bad, too much English. And they try to take all sorts of steps to prevent the spread of English in China. I mean, I won't go into all the details, like reduce the amount of English in the curriculum. What happens then? Or reduce the amount of English on the Gaokao. What happens? The students go to special schools that their parents send them to make up for the absence in the regular curriculum. Or the good schools in China, like Fudan and Nankai and Beida, Tsinghua, they all have their own special English examination if you want to get into the top schools. Or if you want to get a great job. So that's English. But see, English is also part of this creeping Romanization, because people, for all the reasons that I outlined above in this lecture, people are using a lot of Romanization in their Chinese writing, including forgetting how to write shrimp and egg. And here's one. This is a classic instance. A friend of mine who teaches at Renmin Daxue, an American, named David Mosier. Do you know that name? Okay. So David Mosier, he ran huge tests on Chinese students at Renmin Da and Beida. And I think nobody could write Da Punti, sneeze, even though they all sneezed every day, or they sneezed a lot, but they couldn't write it. So sometimes then they would, well, if you have your computer, the computer will write it for you, okay? No problem. But if you got to do it on a test or in a letter to grandma written by hand or something, then it's bad news, because you can't tell your grandma, I was sneezing a lot this week. And that's just one example. There are many others.